he offered to send it to her by Western Union. He left the apartment a few minutes before 11 a.m. His route downtown took him past Dealey Plaza again. As he drove near the jail, he noticed a large crowd and assumed Oswald had already been transferred. If everything had gone according to plan, Oswald would have been moved to the sheriff's custody nearly an hour earlier. One of the biggest delays to the scheduled transfer was caused by Postal Inspector Harry Holmes' extensive questioning about Oswald's use of his P.O. boxes, which made the session run more than an hour late and did not end until shortly after 11 a.m. Ruby, meanwhile, parked across the street from the Western Union station, only 1 block from police headquarters near 11:05. At Western Union, he patiently waited in line while another customer completed her business. His receipt was stamped at 11:17. When he left Western Union, he was less than 200 steps from the entrance to police headquarters. Now, Ruby walked the 1 block along Main Street and stopped near the 8-foot-wide rampway. It was guarded by policeman E.R. Vaughn. At 11:20, about 55 seconds before Oswald was shot, Lieutenant Rio Pierce drove a black car up the Main Street ramp as part of the decoy plan. Officer Roy Vaughn stepped away from the center of the rampway into the middle of Main Street to stop the traffic so Pierce could safely exit. Ruby slipped inside while Vaughn was distracted. He walked down the ramp and arrived at the back of a crowd of police and press only seconds before Oswald was brought past. Oswald was taken downstairs from the 3rd floor to the basement. Cramped inside the garage confines were almost 30 reporters and 70 police. Just as they reached the edge of the ramp, recalled policeman Don Archer, who was stationed directly across from where Ruby broke through, I caught the movement of a man. As I moved forward, I saw the man reach Oswald, raise up, and then the shot was fired. As he fired, Ruby yelled, "You killed my president, you rat." Oswald was fatally shot through the stomach. Several policemen immediately tackled Ruby. Earl Ruby, his brother, hired a flamboyant San Francisco attorney, Melvin Belli, the king of torts, to defend Jack. In Texas, there was a crime called murder without malice, equivalent to manslaughter in most states. The maximum penalty for such a conviction was 5 years. However, Belli gambled that he could acquit Ruby completely and argued that the family had a history of mental illness and that he was insane when he shot Oswald. Belli took a good 5-year murder without malice case, says Bill Alexander, Dallas Assistant District Attorney, and made it into a death penalty for his client. On March 14, 1964, deliberating less than an hour, a Dallas jury returned a guilty verdict of premeditated murder, sentencing Ruby to be executed for the crime. After his arrest, there had been a steady mental deterioration, and the conviction hastened his decline. Jack tried to kill himself on several occasions. On October 5, 1966, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted him a new trial on the grounds that his statements to Dallas policemen immediately after the shooting should not have been allowed, and that the original court should have granted a change of venue to another jurisdiction, since a fair trial was all but impossible in Dallas. When a sheriff arrived in December 1966 to move Ruby for his new trial, he seemed too sick. At Parkland Hospital, he was first diagnosed with pneumonia, but a day later the doctors realized he had cancer in his liver, brain, and lungs. Ruby died officially of a blood clot on January 3, 1967, more than 3 years after he shot Oswald. Ruby's Sunday murder of Oswald stimulated many heightened suspicions and rumors. Lyndon Johnson intervened on Friday, November 29th, with Executive Order number 11130, which created a fact-finding panel he hoped would have a national mandate. Johnson appointed a 7-man panel of distinguished public servants that he thought had unimpeachable credentials. 72-year-old Earl Warren, Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, was chosen as chairman. Of the 6 other panelists, 2 were ranking senators, John Sherman Cooper, a Kentucky Republican, and Richard Russell, a Georgia Democrat. 2 were senior House representatives, Congressman Hale Boggs, a Louisiana Democrat and the Majority Whip, and Gerald Ford, a Michigan Republican. The final members were prominent attorneys, John J. McCloy, former president of the World Bank, and Allen Dulles, the CIA's former spy master. The commission had subpoena power, as well as the right to grant immunity to compel testimony otherwise protected under the Fifth Amendment's self-incrimination article. All federal and state agencies were ordered to comply fully with its request. The commission's general counsel was former U.S. Solicitor General J. Lee Rankin, and 14 lawyers comprised the legal staff under his supervision. There were 12 investigators. The legal staff divided the case into 5 general subjects: the assassination's basic facts, the identity of the assassin, his background and motives, possible conspiracy, and Oswald's death. The staff attorneys determined the facts and were responsible for draft findings. Major disputes were brought to the attention of the 7 commissioners. Marina Oswald, the first witness, appeared on February 3, 1964. The commission and its staff took testimony from 552 witnesses during the next 6 months. The FBI's field investigation was, by itself, enormous. It conducted 25,000 interviews and submitted over 2,300 investigative reports, totaling more than 25,000 pages. The Secret Service conducted another 1,500 interviews and submitted 800 reports. The 888-page final report was released on September 24, 1964. Although the Commission had done an extraordinary job of marshaling information and presenting it in a cohesive and organized manner, in only 10 months it was not possible to delve into many issues that later came to the forefront. The FBI, anxious to downplay its contacts with Oswald, withheld information from the Commission, including Agent Hosty's receipt of a note from Oswald. It also deleted Hosty's name, address, and telephone number, which was in Oswald's address book when the information was sent to the Commission staff. The single bullet theory was not the result of positive evidence that clearly established it, but an attempt to create a scenario to fit the facts as the Commission determined them. Unless one bullet caused the wounds to both Governor Connally and President Kennedy, the Commission could not figure out how Oswald could have fired the 3 shots within the approximately 5 seconds they mistakenly allotted to him. Though advances in neutron activation and photographic and computer techniques now confirm the theory is correct, the Commission had no way of being certain the single bullet was viable. The members were split in their feelings about the theory, and Senator Russell threatened not to sign a final report that concluded the single bullet was correct. The Warren Commission report settled on, "There is very persuasive evidence." This type of compromise opened more doors to critics. But the most controversial aspect of the Commission's work may be its conclusion about the possibility of any conspiracy. The final report stated, "The Commission has found no evidence that either Lee Harvey Oswald or Jack Ruby was part of any conspiracy, domestic or foreign, to assassinate President Kennedy." There is no question Oswald was the lone shooter, says former staff lawyer Bert Griffin. There is nothing that then establishes a conspiracy theory, but there is plenty there that would allow a reasonable person to speculate about a conspiracy theory. By the time the Warren Commission published in September 1964, a network of amateur sleuths was prepared to check its accuracy against the research they had compiled since the day of the murder. Each soon carved out a specialty. The first major commercial success for a Commission critic was in 1966 with Rush to Judgment by New York attorney Mark Lane. Lane had represented Marguerite Oswald. Reportedly, Rush to Judgment sold more than 1 million copies in various editions. Lane's attack on the Commission was an admitted brief for the defense by a skilled advocate. Using only the evidence that buttressed his arguments, he persuasively argued that the Commission's work was seriously flawed. And while he was careful in his book about whom he accused and about the scope of the conspiracy he said he had discovered, in his dozens of college lectures and radio and television appearances, he went much further, charging complicity at the highest levels of government. Walter Cronkite, in a 4-part 1967 CBS documentary, concluded there were a number of examples in Lane's work of, quote, lifting remarks out of context to support his theories. Perhaps the most charitable explanation is that Mark Lane still considers himself a defense attorney whose duty is not to abstract truth, but to his client, Oswald, end quote. A rash of books appeared on the heels of Lane's success. At their best, the critics had only exposed the Commission as incompetent, but they had not established it was wrong in its conclusions. Authors like Lane were assisted by the informal alliance of self-appointed researchers, whom writer Calvin Trillin dubbed the Buffs in a 1967 New Yorker article. In 1967, the publication of 2 significant books, both written by graduates of the Buff Network, added to the growing mistrust of the Commission's work. In 6 Seconds in Dallas, Josiah Thompson tried to determine what happened at Dealey Plaza by focusing on ballistics, trajectory angles, medical evidence, and eyewitness testimony. Thompson was the first conspiracy writer who had studied the original Zapruder film, and his book was the first to include drawings of critical frames. His book focused exclusively on how the assassination of the president physically happened, and he did not bother with other issues. Ruby was mentioned only once, and Tippit not at all. Thompson concluded there was a crossfire in Dealey Plaza from shooters perched in the book depository, on the grassy knoll, and in the records building on Euston Street. The second book that further damaged the Commission was Sylvia Marr's Accessories After the Fact. Marr probably knew the 26 volumes of the Warren Commission better than any of the other critics. A year earlier, she had published an index to the Warren Commission, generally received as an important contribution for research since the volumes originally had only a name index, making it almost impossible to work effectively with all the 1 million+ words. Her book concentrated on any testimony or exhibits that raised doubts about the final report. On July 4, 1967, Lyndon Johnson signed into law the Freedom of Information and Privacy Act. It allowed private citizens to apply for the release of federal government files, even including those maintained by the FBI, CIA, and other sensitive organizations. The government agencies could only refuse to release the documents if they fell under privacy or security exemptions that were set forth in the law. The federal agencies were initially very reluctant to comply with FOIA, and researchers were often forced to resort to lawsuits to win the release of even the simplest documents. The attitude of government agencies toward FOIA prompted suspicion about motives, especially since researchers sometimes had to fight for apparently innocuous documents. To many, that obstinacy added to the growing public perception that the government had something to hide in the Kennedy case. The momentum against the Warren Commission led to the introduction of a congressional resolution to re-examine the case. Yet the passage of FOIA and the new resolution were overshadowed by another event that had started in July 1966, which temporarily electrified the critics and the nation. Jim Garrison, the flamboyant New Orleans district attorney, convinced there were suspects in his city that had been part of a conspiracy to kill JFK, had launched the first official investigation into the assassination since the Warren Commission. Jim Garrison had attended Tulane Law School, graduated in 1949, and was an FBI agent for 2 years. In July 1951, he asked to be placed on active service with the National Guard. He was relieved from duty 15 months later. Doctors found he suffered from a severe and disabling psychoneurosis. The recommendation was long-term psychotherapy. After his release from the Guard, he worked first for a private law firm and then became an assistant district attorney. He left the DA's office in 1958 and developed a flamboyant reputation for expensive suits and cigars and 4-martini lunches at the city's best restaurants. He unsuccessfully campaigned to be a judge of the criminal court during the 1959 election, and 2 years later was running against the incumbent district attorney. In May 1962, Garrison and his staff were sworn into office. He embarked almost immediately on a cleanup of vice in the French Quarter, and while his work resulted in no trials or convictions, he received national press attention for his raiding parties. JFK's murder was something that had been on his mind. The investigation, which began in secret shortly after Garrison's second term commenced, was initially based on 2 leads. The first involved David Ferry, an eccentric, self-styled adventurer. 2 days after the president was killed, Jack Martin, a private investigator, called an assistant district attorney in New Orleans with the information that Ferry had been in Dallas about 2 weeks before, had been corresponding with Oswald, and had taught Oswald how to shoot. Garrison's investigators ransacked Ferry's apartment, picked him up several days later, and turned him over to the FBI for questioning. The Bureau quickly determined that Martin's information was false. Martin acknowledged he was drunk when he made the call to the district attorney's office and confessed that his motivation was revenge for Ferry having excluded him from several cases. The second lead that revived Garrison's interest in the assassination was a story told by Dean Andrews, an attorney with a reputation for exaggeration and showmanship. After the assassination, he told the FBI that he recognized Oswald as a person he had done legal work for during the summer of 1963. He claimed that on the day after the assassination, a man called Clay Bertrand, who he casually knew, telephoned him while Andrews was in the hospital recovering from pneumonia. Bertrand allegedly asked if he would defend Oswald for killing the president. Andrews, who had a reputation as an ambulance chaser, could not explain why anyone would want him to represent the accused assassin. There was no Clay Bertrand. In April, the FBI confronted Andrews with the fact that they had failed to find anyone who had ever heard the name. He confessed his entire story was fictitious. Yet when he appeared before the Warren Commission 3 months later, he revived the original tale. When pushed about the existence of a Bertrand and the call asking him to defend Oswald, Andrews again backed off, saying, "I was smoking weed. Let's just forget about it. I was full of dope." Garrison, however, believed that Bertrand was a key to the assassination puzzle. In October 1966, Garrison began calling Andrews, as well as some of Ferry's friends, into the office. In late November 1966, Garrison shocked his staff when he announced that he had decided Clay Bertrand was actually Clay Shaw, a prominent civic figure and the man who had almost single-handedly led the historic restoration of the French Quarter. Shaw was an active member of the city's social elite, as well as a poet and a playwright. Garrison knew he was gay, and he thought that provided a link to Ferry, also homosexual. One of Garrison's assistants pointed out that Shaw was 6 feet 4 inches tall and had white hair, while Andrews had described Bertrand as 5'8" and with sandy hair. That was a false description to protect his client, retorted Garrison. Shaw was brought in for questioning in late December 1966, and it was evident he did not know anything. In early 1967, Garrison's office had to file public papers to explain why it needed additional funds. Reporters for the New Orleans States-Item obtained the papers which listed the office's investigation into the Kennedy case. The States-Item broke the story on February 17th. Within a day, reporters from more than 30 countries descended on the district attorney's office. The Buffs also flocked to New Orleans. Once the investigation was public, Garrison began to put more pressure on Ferry, calling in more of his associates for questioning. When he learned that Ferry had known ex-FBI agent Guy Bannister, who died of a heart attack in 1964, he extended the probe toward Bannister and the anti-Castro Cubans. Early in February, Garrison was introduced to Gordon Novell, an anti-eavesdropping expert he wanted to use to ensure his office was not bugged by the FBI. He discovered that Novell knew Ferry. Garrison suggested that Ferry was stonewalling the investigation by lying, and that one solution might be for Novell to shoot Ferry with a tranquilizer dart and then inject him with sodium pentothal to obtain the details of the assassination plot. Novell said he saw apparent forgeries of letters purportedly from Oswald to Ferry in the district attorney's office. On February 21st, Novell, appalled by Garrison's tactics, left. The next day, David Ferry was found dead in his apartment. Garrison announced it was a suicide, interpreting a letter to a friend as a suicide note. The autopsy revealed he died a natural death by a berry aneurysm, the bursting of a blood vessel in the skull, a death that could not be induced. On Wednesday, March 1st, 1967, Garrison arrested Clay Shaw and charged him with being part of a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy. 2 days after Shaw's arrest, Garrison agreed to meet Jim Phelan of the Saturday Evening Post in Las Vegas. He decided to give him the exclusive story behind Shaw's arrest. Phelan asked Garrison what the motivation was behind the conspiracy. He replied, "It was a homosexual thrill killing. John Kennedy was everything that Dave Ferry was not. A successful, handsome, popular, wealthy, virile man. You can just picture the charge Ferry got out of plotting his death." Near the end of his interviews with Phelan, the district attorney walked to the dresser in his hotel room and picked up a thick manila envelope. He said, "I've got a witness who ties this whole case together." Garrison's star witness was a 25-year-old Baton Rouge insurance salesman, Perry Raymond Russo. He had given a February 24th television interview to WDSU-TV in New Orleans, in which he said he knew Ferry and that Ferry did not like Kennedy. As for Oswald, Russo later said, "I never heard of him until a television on the assassination." On February 25th, Assistant District Attorney Andrew Shambra interviewed Russo. In a memo, Shambra reported the results to Garrison. Russo said Ferry never issued a direct threat against Kennedy. When Shambra showed Russo photos of Oswald and Shaw, Russo thought he might have seen Shaw twice, once at a gas station and once at the Nashville Street Wharf. As for Oswald, Russo drew a beard on the photo and said it resembled one of Ferry's roommates. He actually confused Oswald with Jim Llewellyn, a Ferry roommate. 2 days later, Russo submitted to sodium pentothal. While interrogating Russo, who was in a semi-conscious state, Shambra introduced the name Clay Bertrand. Russo had never heard the name before. On March 1st, Russo was placed under hypnosis by Dr. Esmond Fatter, whom Garrison had hired, though he had no background in using hypnosis to elicit criminal testimony. Fatter insinuated the idea of a conspiracy in Clay Shaw. Shortly after introducing the image of Shaw during the hypnotic trance, Fatter said, "Let your mind go completely blank, Perry. See that television screen again. It is very vivid. Now notice the picture on the screen. There will be a Bertrand, Ferry, and Oswald, and they are going to discuss a very important matter. And there is another man and girl there, and they are talking about assassinating somebody. Look at it and describe it to me." Russo had never talked about a plan to kill anyone. He then responded for the first time. They planned to assassinate President Kennedy. As the session continued, he elaborated that there would be crossfire. Phelan could not believe that Garrison had provided him with the Shambra memorandum of the original meeting with Russo, which utterly impeached the credibility of his star witness. The March 14th preliminary hearing to determine if there was probable cause to hold Shaw for trial was held before a three-judge panel. The judges took less than half an hour to rule that Shaw should be held for trial on the charge of conspiring to kill the president. However, it was not long before the DA's witnesses were under attack. On June 19th, NBC News aired the devastating results of an investigation into Garrison's work. The show disclosed the extent to which the district attorney's office had tried to bribe and intimidate witnesses into giving favorable testimony. Within several weeks of the NBC show, William Gerbich, Garrison's chief investigator, resigned and told Robert Kennedy that Garrison's case was a sham. Perhaps the most outrageous part of the sideshow that Garrison conducted with the media were his pronouncements on the number of assassins at Dealey Plaza. When he started his investigation, he thought there were only two, one in the depository, and one on the grassy knoll. Eventually, Garrison placed 16 assassins at 5 locations in Dealey Plaza. His preoccupation with conspiracies was not confined to Kennedy. After telling the press that Havana had sent a hired assassin who was stalking him, he hired bodyguards and used code language when talking about the case over the phone. On January 21, 1969, the trial finally began, nearly 2 years after Shaw was arrested. Garrison presented the same basic prosecution he had in the 1967 preliminary hearing. This time, the problems in his case were readily apparent. Russo testified that he had seen Ferry, Oswald, and Shaw at the party, but said they might have been just shooting the bull. Dean Andrews took the stand and admitted that Clay Bertrand was an invented character. Trying to prevent his case from falling apart, Garrison introduced the Clinton, Louisiana witnesses who said they had seen Shaw with Oswald and Ferry in the late summer or early fall of 1963. Then he produced a surprise witness, a tense New York accountant, Charles Speisel. He testified he had attended a party several months before the one Russo described, and Ferry, Oswald, and Shaw had been there and had openly discussed their plans to kill Kennedy. Under cross-examination, Speisel admitted he himself had been the victim of a conspiracy for 16 years in which the New York police and his own psychiatrist had invaded every part of his existence, and that when his daughter returned home from school, he fingerprinted her to ensure it was not an imposter. As the case against Shaw collapsed, Garrison concentrated on what appeared to be a second prosecution, one against the Warren report and its conclusion of a lone assassin. Although not relevant in determining Shaw's guilt or innocence, he called Marina Oswald, autopsy pathologist Pierre Fink, and witnesses from Dealey Plaza. He subpoenaed the Zapruder film and showed it 10 times to the Shaw jury. The jury returned in 45 minutes with an acquittal on their first ballot. 2 days later, Garrison arrested Shaw for perjury, claiming that when Shaw testified he did not know Ferry or Oswald, he had lied. It took another 2 years of legal fighting before a federal court on June 7, 1971, finally issued a permanent injunction against Garrison from prosecuting Shaw on the grounds that the charges had been brought in bad faith. Garrison never abandoned his zealous beliefs. In 1988, he published On the Trail of the Assassins, in which he regurgitated all of his theories developed in 1966 and 1967, though they were clearly outdated. Garrison died at the age of 70 on October 21, 1992. However, Garrison lived to see director Oliver Stone use more than $50 million of Warner Brothers money to rehabilitate Garrison's theories and again tarnish the name of an innocent man, Clay Shaw, for yet another generation. In March 1975, Geraldo Rivera aired the Zapruder film on ABC's Goodnight America. Millions were shocked by its graphic detail, especially the image of Kennedy's head snapping back and to the left after the final shot. Without an understanding of the medical evidence or the physics involved, it appeared as though the president reacted to a bullet fired from the front, rather than the rear as the commission had concluded. I also think the disclosures about Watergate had an effect, says James Lassar, the FOIA attorney for many researchers. It reminded people of how duplicitous government leaders could be, and it created the right atmosphere for a renewed look at the assassination. In 1975, the work of the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities revealed yet another persuasive reason for a new investigation. It had discovered that the CIA, with the assistance of the Mafia, had repeatedly tried to assassinate Cuba's Fidel Castro during the early 1960s. The CIA had not kept President Kennedy fully informed about the assassination plots, and most of the Warren Commission members had never even heard anything about them. A group of congressmen began working to empower a select committee to investigate the deaths of both Martin Luther King, Jr. and JFK. The committee accomplished some important work. Its forensic panel, which had complete access to the autopsy x-rays and photographs, together with the firearms and photographic panels, found unequivocally that JFK had been wounded only twice, and that both shots came from Oswald's rifle, fired from the southeast corner of the schoolbook depository. In December 1978, the Select Committee reviewed a draft of a lengthy final report. It concluded the Warren Commission was basically correct, and that Oswald alone had killed Kennedy and Tippit. But late that month, acoustics experts Mark Weiss and Ernst Ashkenazi came forward with their interpretation of the Dallas Dictabelt recording from the police motorcycle, ostensibly proving a fourth shot was fired from the grassy knoll. A majority of the committee scuttled the 600-page draft and approved a preliminary 9-page summary of finding and recommendations that concluded, based solely on the flawed acoustics findings, that there was a conspiracy to kill JFK involving a second gunman. Since the committee had decided there was a conspiracy, it felt obliged to assess the probable identity of the conspirators. Although it could never prove Oswald had personal contact with any mobster, the Select Committee nevertheless concluded that while, quote, the National Syndicate of Organized Crime as a group were not involved in the assassination, it could not preclude the possibility that individual members may have been involved, end quote. Suspicion focused on Teamster boss Jimmy Hoffa, Tampa Godfather Santo Trafficante, and New Orleans boss Carlos Marcello. Is there credible evidence that Hoffa, Trafficante, and Marcello were involved in the assassination of President Kennedy? As for Hoffa, the committee found evidence that he had spoken about wanting Robert Kennedy dead, but could find nothing to show his interest went beyond the talking stage or extended to JFK. The sole evidence the Select Committee found implicating Santo Trafficante was provided by a Cuban exile, Jose Aleman. He boasted to committee investigators that although he only casually knew Trafficante, the mob boss had confided to him over a year before the assassination that the president was, quote, going to be hit, end quote. In his public testimony before the committee, Aleman recanted and said it was only his impression that Trafficante meant the president was going to be hit. Carlos Marcello, as the godfather of New Orleans, received special attention from the Select Committee since Oswald had spent the summer of 1963 there. Edward Becker was a speculator in the oil business who says he tried to interest Marcello in distributing an oil additive he had invented. During their discussions, Becker mentioned Bobby Kennedy, and the godfather lost his temper and spoke of using a nut for an assassination. Becker said Marcello added, "If you want to kill a dog, you don't cut off the tail, you cut off the head." Another man present, Carl Rapolo, denied Marcello ever said anything like that and was not even sure if there was a meeting with Becker. The House Select Committee concluded it was extremely unlikely that Marcello would discuss a plot to kill the president with anyone but his closest lieutenants. The committee also discovered that Becker had a questionable reputation for honesty. Those who have investigated and studied the mafia do not believe there is any credible evidence that the mob was involved in the JFK assassination. I spent thousands of hours listening to surveillance tapes on the top mobsters in the country, says Bill Romer, who led the FBI's fight in Chicago against the mafia. They constantly talked about how they hated Bobby Kennedy, but they never talked or showed any interest in assassinating him. When the assassination of the president happened, they discussed it relentlessly, but there was never any sign they had anything to do with it. Although the mob thesis is the current favorite, critics have flooded the field with new and ever-changing theories. Dallas researcher David Perry has compiled the names of 30 men who have either been identified by buffs or confessed to being the second assassin. This is a major part of the problem with the Kennedy assassination right now, says Perry. You have people coming forward with phony stories, and some critics are so willing to believe they have solved the case that they print it without properly checking their facts. There are also some forged documents being produced, and this could do real damage to the historical record. And, unfortunately, a lot of the research that is getting printed in books is secondary work, just one author citing another. That means that stories that are wrong are getting repeated over and over, in many cases getting embellished in each retelling. People believe these stories just because they see them in print so often. In Appointment in Dallas, Hugh MacDonald tells the story of a man who claimed to be the second shooter at Dealey Plaza as part of a CIA plot. In Reasonable Doubt, Henry Hurt laid out the intricate details of a plot involving Oswald, the CIA, and anti-Castro Cubans, based upon the unverified word of Robert Easterling, a person committed to a mental institution. In his latest book on the assassination, Plausible Denial, Mark Lane extensively relied on the word of Marita Lorenz, who claimed to be a former mistress of Fidel Castro. She spins an incredible tale of CIA complicity and recounts cross-country car trips with Oswald and meetings with Ruby and the CIA's E. Howard Hunt. The problem is, as Edwin Lopez, a former researcher for the House Select Committee, says, Marita is not credible. For a time, convicted Texas hitman Charles Harrelson, incidentally the father of actor Woody Harrelson, was pinpointed as one of the assassins disguised as a tramp. Oliver Stone's film JFK, released late in 1991, portrayed Garrison as a hero standing up bravely to the forces that killed the president. But JFK is a blatant mix of fact and fiction that is a microcosm of what has happened throughout the assassination research community. There are, however, researchers who sincerely believe they are seeking the truth, and others who hold on to the concept of a conspiracy with an almost religious fervor. The ready acceptance by most Americans, though few have bothered to read the Warren Report, does not surprise those who study the phenomenon. Historian Henry Steele Commager said, "I do think there has come up in recent years something that might be called a conspiracy psychology, a feeling that great events can't be explained by ordinary processes. The conspiracy theory, the conspiracy mentality, will not accept ordinary evidence. There's some psychological requirement that forces them to reject the ordinary and find refuge in the extraordinary. The search for a darker truth than the lone assassin seems unquenchable. The desire to find a conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination will continue to be answered for years by more confessions, witnesses who change their testimony to recall disturbing events, the appearance of papers of dubious authenticity, and by writers and researchers who present cases of guilt by association supported by rumor and innuendo. But for those seeking the truth, the facts are incontrovertible. They can be tested against credible testimony, documents, and the latest scientific advances. Chasing shadows on the grassy knoll will never substitute for real history. Lee Harvey Oswald, driven by his own twisted and impenetrable furies, was the only assassin at Dealey Plaza on November 22, 1963. To say otherwise, in light of the overwhelming evidence, is to absolve a man with blood on his hands and to mock the president he killed. End of Side 4. Copyright 1993 by the Publishing Mills, Incorporated.